There are some very exciting developments in the chess world as Hans Niemann met with former world champion Vladimir Kramnik in his home country, Switzerland. Hans Niemann is in Europe now. He's playing a lot of tournaments, and between some of his tournaments he met with the former world champion to have some training. And now you may think this is nothing special. Well, we have to go back a few months. If you have been following my channel, you remember the story that Hans played online with Vladimir and he crushed him in a very spectacular game with the Berlin defense. And that's remarkable because Vladimir Kramnik is the man who reintroduced the Berlin defense at the highest level by defeating former world champion Garry Kasparov in their match in London in 2000. Then, after that game, they played a rematch, Hans and Vladimir. And look what happened there. Hans played the move e4 and then Vladimir played f6. Very bad move, never play that. Hans played the move d4. And now after the move g5, what is this? This is the fool's mate. You shouldn't do this. And here Hans was thinking, of course, he could just have given checkmate with the move queen h5. But instead of doing that, he resigned the game. And that led to a lot of speculations. Was Vladimir Kramnik accusing Hans Niemann of cheating? Well, that is the big question. After that, both players responded. And Vladimir said, well, he didn't say that much, but Hans said, okay, I'm willing to train with you and to show you that I'm totally innocent, that I'm a good chess player. And Kramnik said, well, you can come to Amsterdam. He was playing a tournament in Amsterdam, but unfortunately Hans couldn't come there to have some talks with Vladimir because he was playing at the World Juniors at that time in Mexico. But now, eventually they met in Switzerland and they have been working together. And it would be very interesting to know, of course, the details of this training session. But for now, not much has been revealed yet. But what I would like to show you is some study which Hans Niemann posted online because he posted it on Twitter. It's the following position. You can see it here, and it's clear that Vladimir Kramnik showed this position to him. Now I would like to solve this position with you so we can get an idea what they have been working on to see the skills of Hans Niemann. I think Vladimir was, of course, interested in his calculation ability. So let's have a look at the position together. We see that white is 2 pieces down. Black has 2 extra knights, but white has a very strong passed pawn. It's 2 squares away from queening. If the pawn can be queened, it will definitely be game over. But the question is, should white run with the pawn now? Or should he try to cut off the path for the defensive pieces to stop the pawn? Well, if you try the latter option, like you'd play here the move c5. Now there is not really time to take the bishop or even take the pawn on c5 because after that there is this move a7 and the pawn cannot be stopped. However, after this move c5, black can play here this brilliant move. He's not going to take the material, but he's going to play this move, bishop a3. And now the problem is that if you run with the pawn, there is the move bishop takes c5 with check. And after king takes the knight, it's bishop takes a7 and black is material up and will win the game. So this means that the move c5 is not good. But what can be done instead? Let's go back to the initial position. Instead of playing the move pawn to c5, there is this option to run with the pawn immediately. So now the big difference is that after this move a7, the knight can still come to b6 and the knight controls the promotion square. This is very important because if nothing happens, black is just going to take the material. First the bishop, then the pawns, and eventually black will win the game. So what should be played here? Very important that, okay, you cannot promote a pawn because the knight will capture the pawn. If you take the knight, well, then black can simply take the bishop. Everything is under control. If you now play the move c5, trying to chase the knight away from the queening square, there is still the move knight a8. Of course, the knight is badly placed in the corner, but it does block the pawn. And black has a simple plan just of wrapping up the pawns with its bishop or even with the king. Black is winning here. So we take it back. Now, instead of taking the knight, it's very important, especially in these endgame studies, but also in middle games, that you need to act immediately. You need to set priorities here for yourself. And the most important thing to do is try to promote a pawn and deflect the most important defender. So now you play here this move c5. You're attacking the knight. And if the knight goes away, well, the pawn can be promoted. And there's not much black can do apart from going with that knight to a8. So the pawn is stopped and it looks as if everything is under control here for black. But white needs to keep the game going. Black is about to take the bishop. So the bishop goes away to d5. That's a very important move because now the bishop is safe. But at the same time, white is just about to take the knight on a8. After that, you can move the bishop and then the pawn will be promoted. So this is a very important line. Now there are various options and black definitely needs to try to stop the pawn. Well, what he can do here first is a move like bishop a3. So the idea is that if you do get a chance, then you will take the pawn on c5 with check and later the pawn on a7. Now, for instance, if you take first the knight on f1, there is bishop takes c5, bishop takes a8, and bishop takes a7. Black has managed to eliminate a pawn, but how to evaluate this endgame? It's opposite colored bishops. And in fact, this is just a theoretical draw. And it's very instructive to see why this is just a draw. Because the only thing white needs to do is stay with the king in the corner. Because black's pawn can never be promoted. For instance, if you play the move c5, you put a bishop on d5. And if you run with the pawn, white can just give up that bishop. Bishop takes pawn, king takes c4, and we stay with the king in the corner. If you now come closer with the king, let's say king d3, king g2, king e2, king h1, there's absolutely no way to make progress. Because if you get the king closer, it will just be stalemate. Right? So we go back. Now you understand that you also don't want white can just capture that knight on f1. And instead, the critical move here for black is to try to save that knight first with the move knight e2. That's a very interesting idea because you're saving that knight. Of course, the other knight in the corner can be taken and white is just 2 moves away from queening the pawn. If the bishop moves, then the pawn can reach the a8 square. But there is this move, bishop a3. And now we realize that if the bishop goes away, let's say you play a move like bishop g2, for instance. There's bishop takes c5 with check. And there's no chance for white to promote the pawn. You first have to solve the check. Then the pawn will be taken. And here we see the material. Black has an extra knight. And white absolutely has no chances here to get rid of the remaining material. So white is losing here in this position. Also, if you play another move, if you don't move the bishop away, but for instance, you try to save your pawn by putting it on c6, there will follow bishop c5, check, and if the king goes away, you take the pawn. So here we are in a critical situation, as it looks as if white's position is desperately lost. However, when you're on the defensive side, you need to think how you can try to save the game. There's not much material left on the board, so trying to get rid of the remaining material is one idea. But one defensive idea you should always look at is if there are any stalemate possibilities. Well, there is one absolutely insane idea here. And the question is, of course, when Vladimir Kramnik showed this position to Hans, could Hans find this idea? Well, I think a player of Hans' strength definitely can see this idea. But I think for most of you, this is very difficult to spot. But the brilliant idea here is the move bishop back to h1. And this makes a huge difference with other bishop moves. Because now, after taking the pawn on c5 with check, the king will go to g2. And now after bishop takes a7, wait a second, white cannot make a move here. Look at this bishop, it's blocked in the corner by its king. The pawns, they cannot move, and the knight is covering the squares from the king. Also the bishop covers all these squares, so the king can't go anywhere. Also the pawn on h4 prevent the king from coming to g3. This is an absolutely insane stalemate motive. Fantastic idea. I'm hoping Hans and Vladimir, they had a good time together. Hopefully for Hans, Kramnik got a better opinion of his chess skills. But what do you think? How got the two along with each other. They appreciate each other's support. They enjoyed each other's company. I'm very curious to see if this is gonna help Hans his future development as a top grandmaster. We will see more and hopefully more scandalous news, of course, from the chess world. Stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you soon back. Bye bye.